Robert Taylor was given the nickname Tut by his brother at a very young age, and he grew up in a poor household in Georgia, but it was one filled with music. His entire family played. Additionally, Tut would follow around two black blind musicians that would play in and around the area and just became absolutely enamored by the music. And this was likely where Tut developed his very bluesy style of playing. In the 1940s, Tut would play dance halls, and he started playing an electric steel guitar as well as mandolin. But it was when Tut heard Brother Oswald playing the dobro with Roy Acuff on the Grand Ole Opry through the radio that he had found his instrument. But unfortunately, he didn't know what the instrument was. He had to write a letter to Roy Acuff, and Roy's wife, Mildred, wrote Tut back and told him Brother Oswald played a dobro. Well, on a trip to Salt Lake City, Tut hit a music shop in Chicago, and he was able to find two dobros for sale. The first he bought for $27.50. The second he got for $65. Now, he didn't know that the majority of people played the dobro with finger picks, so he learned to flat pick the dobro, and he held the bar in his left hand in a very unique way. When Tut was 7, he fell off a plank and he scratched his hand on a rusty nail and ended up getting blood poisoning, and he actually almost died from it. A doctor had to lance his hand between the fingers, and his aunt helped him with physio, but it was never 100%. But despite playing with a flat pick and the issue with his left hand, he became a very good picker. And he also started to collect dobros. He loved the different sounds that all of them seemed to make. At one point, he had 67 dobros, and the only reason he stopped was he ran out of room in his house. Soon, dobro players all over the US knew to contact Tut if they wanted a top quality instrument. He actually had 4 phones in his house at one point. And this helped provide additional income to his actual job as a sign painter in Milledgeville, Georgia. Now, Tut was not just a collector of dobros, but he also collected and connected with other musicians. Tut started to travel to Galax, Bean Blossom, Camp Springs, and he would organize these elaborate bluegrass picking parties. He ingratiated himself into the fiddlers' conventions popular at the time. Tut would reserve whole blocks of rooms and would organize these bluegrass jam sessions where musicians would come from all over. After the Asheville Fiddlers Convention, Tut had to move everyone out to the Westgate Shopping Center parking lot to play late into the night, possibly the first parking lot picking event, and actually the song that we're listening to right now is named after that event, the Westgate. This was years before the first Bluegrass Festival ever developed. Now, it was at this time he also found out about the Griffith family selling mandolins. They also were selling Gibson catalogs and sheet music. And see, the Griffith School of Music had mandolin orchestras, and it was a Gibson dealer in the 1920s for the area. And Dr. William Griffith's wife loved the look of the F5 mandolin, but the points of the mandolin dug into her leg. So Gibson made her the smoothed A5 mandolin, but she wanted that kind of nice styling that the F5 had. So it was the first A5 signed by Lloyd Loar, made by Gibson, and it was the only one ever made signed by Loar. In addition to catalogs and sheet music, Tut Taylor walked away with the F5 and the A5 Gibson Lloyd Loar mandolins. Well, Tut started paying a lot closer attention to all the instruments that people played, and he started to buy, sell, and trade those instruments. He thought that sounded the best. He became a sponge, though, listening to those pickers and those more knowledgeable than him about vintage instruments, herringbone Martin guitars from the 1930s, Lloyd Loar signed mandolins from Gibson in the 1920s, pre-war Gibson flathead banjos, and of course, vintage dobros. He became known as the guy who you would go to get a bluegrass instrument. One of the more famous stories at the time was in the mid-60s, he put an ad into the Bluegrass Unlimited paper, a kind of a joke ad, that he had an old Lloyd Loar mandolin for sale. It had never been played by John Duffy, never been repaired by Tom Morgan, and never been owned by Harry West. The joke is that it would be extremely rare to find a Lloyd Loar mandolin that had not been touched by these 3 individuals. And he decided that he would put what at the time was a crazy price tag for the mandolin, $1,000. In addition to musicians, Tut also connected with some of the top luthiers and craftsmen involved in making and fixing bluegrass instruments. Randy Wood, Mike Longworth, and Tom Morgan became good friends with Tut. In addition to playing and collecting instruments, he started to build and work on them in a small shop, and he hired Randy Wood to help build and repair those guitars, mandolins. He also started to build 5-string necks that would convert pre-war Gibson tenor banjos to the much desired 5-string banjos that bluegrass players really wanted, because Earl played one, and they were one of the first to do so. Additionally, they developed a very unique 12-string dobro. Armed with contacts that he had made in his 12-string dobro, he recorded one of the 3 Folk Swingers albums. It's the album we're listening to right now, and it included a studio band. It had Glenn Campbell on a 12-string guitar and Doug and Rodney Dillard. Tut also recorded his first solo album, Dobro Country, along with Clarence and Roland White. But in part 2, we'll find out what happens when Tut meets George and moves from Milledgeville, Georgia to Nashville.